Hi, hello, welcome to the Physionic Podcast, or welcome back to the Physionic Podcast. If you're new here, my name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a doctorate student in molecular medicine, and today we're going to be discussing a particular study, I guess it's a study, not too involved, although I'm sure a ton of work went into it. But the concept is rather simple, and that concept is on metabolism. The question we're going to be answering in this podcast, to simplify it right down to the nuts and bolts, is does your metabolism decrease or does it change with age, number one? And two, when does that occur? Well, actually, also number three, what are the main factors for any changes in metabolism? And we're going to be looking at some data or some science that comes out of a study that called a daily energy expenditure through the human life course. And if you're watching the podcast, you can see the long list of authors or researchers that were involved in this particular study. And it is, they don't have a ton of data, but the acquisition of that data probably took forever, because they ended up, let me check my notes here. They ended up taking data or collecting data from thousands and thousands of people, so to get the results that they ended up getting. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing metabolism, but kind of more in a broad sense, just energy expenditure or calorie expenditure. And with that notion, a lot of people have definitely heard before, many times actually, that people believe that their metabolism starts to slow around age 30. And, you're in your 20s, enjoy your youth, because once you hit about 30, everything's downhill from here. Well, we're going to see if that actually is the case. This is definitely the most comprehensive study on the topic, although I do have a video that discusses metabolic decline with age. And I came to particular conclusions based off of another review that actually looked at a variety of different studies that use different metrics and different ways of testing metabolism, and they came to a conclusion, which I will leave for you to check out. I'll link it if you're interested in actually watching it. It's a pretty short video, but I essentially explain what factors into metabolism, and its declination. Is that a word? Declination. We'll just say with it declining with age. But this, like I said, this study is far more comprehensive, because they just collected data from thousands of people, men and women, as well as kids, as well as people who are all the way into their 90s. So we're going to, is it really true that at around age 30 that our metabolism starts to decline? Or is it maybe our fault, our just habits fault, that we're just shoving too many potato chips in our mouth that are leading to weight gain once you get closer to your 30s. I was so attractive and so lean when I was in my 20s. Now that I'm 39, it's because my metabolism has slowed down. We will see if that truly is the case. Maybe by the tone of voice, you can already tell that's. Well, I won't spoil it, but if you know me by now, maybe by the tone of voice you can tell that might not be true. Okay, so aspects that make up metabolism, really what we're focused on is total daily energy expenditure, TDEE, which I've discussed many times before, but that total daily energy expenditure is made up of your resting metabolic rate. So if you are just lying down, you're not moving, anything like that, so you're taking all that out of the equation, you're just sitting there, how much does it take for your body to function, to run, to keep you alive? And that usually is around 50, 60, sometimes 70% of your metabolism, of your total metabolism, your TDEE, which is what we're going to be focused on. Now, another portion, which is pretty large, is about 20%, is physical activity. Not just exercise, actually also just moving your hands around like I am right now as I'm talking, or just me talking, right? I have to move my mouth up and down, and I have to move my tongue in certain ways, so that uses energy. So all of that is also physical activity, technically. There's a difference, of course, between physical activity and exercise. Exercise is planned, but physical activity is just movement as a whole. So then there's physical activity, and then there's the smallest section is the thermic effect of feeding or food, where particular macronutrients, of course, take a certain amount of energy to break down before they can be used for energy. So, and that usually is like 5 to 10% of our total metabolism. So, with that out of the way, I'm going to have the graphics, as always, for the results. It's not going to take me too long to blast through this, but if you are interested in actually seeing the data, which is really nicely displayed, I think they did a wonderful job. The research, to give kudos to the researchers, I think they did a fantastic job just kind of displaying what the data looks like. I think it looks very pretty. I'll just put it that way. And you can imagine, again, thousands of data points that make up all of these data sequences. So if you'd like to see them, then hop on over to the visual version of the podcast. Okay, so the first thing is to look at, this. They've got this graph that shows, for anybody who's just listening, they've got this graph that just shows all of the different data points from hundreds and hundreds of individuals. So the individual data points are kind of in they're displayed on this graph, and you have the vertical axis, which is metabolism. So 100% rate is what's predicted. So what the researchers predict based off of what formulas that they have. And so that's the 100% mark. And then what they actually saw was anything above that or below that. So they've got these data points that end up displaying across a lifespan. So then on the horizontal axis, they have the age. So all the way from 0, so birth, all the way up to about 95 years old. So they got a lot of data for this. And again, I'll describe what's going on here, but essentially what we see is that the prediction based off of kind of an adult equation is completely wrong when we're looking at infants, or if we're even looking at teenagers. So actually I can use my mouse now that I forgot that I have this. So here we've got our infants, right? So 0 to 5 years old. And if you look here, the predicted, I added this line here across the 100% mark so you can get a better visual of it. But you can see that the dots that make up for men and women, or female and male, because we're not just talking about adult men and women, it's substantially higher than the predicted 100% mark. So it's around 125% metabolism, 150% metabolism. I mean, you're getting around those first few years of life. Metabolism is so high. It's incredibly high. It can be as much as 50% higher than what you would normally predict for an adult, which isn't too shocking. And that actually stays around there for, till about 5, maybe it starts to decline a little bit around age 10, around age 8 or 9, 10. And then it really starts to decline as you go through puberty. Now, just to be clear here, that doesn't mean that you're losing metabolism or anything like that. It's just the fact that the growth, I mean, if you just think about the growth from a month old to 8 years old, that is an explosive amount of growth. And the only way that that's possible is by using tons and tons of energy. So in puberty, while it is also highly metabolically active and highly metabolically demanding, it's still less so than relative to what would be consumed or used if you are 5 or 8 years old. Now, and I'll point this out again in a little bit, but essentially the metabolism starts to decline, but it is still maybe 25% higher than what would be predicted for an adult. So an adult metabolism would still be about considerably lower than what you would see for kids going through puberty. Then it really starts to decline, and it gets to about in your 20s. especially around 25, your metabolism gets to that kind of plateau period. So, and this is based on, this is, again, these dots are the actual what was measured, and this 100% mark is what's predicted. And the prediction is actually quite accurate once it comes to the adult phase. So once you're into like your early 20s and onwards, then you have this plateau that ends up getting created. And interestingly here, we already find our answer for is there I said declination. I don't even know if that's a word, to be honest with you. A decrease in metabolism. Is there a decrease in metabolism after the age of 30? And if we go to 30 here, absolutely not. There's no decrease in metabolism. As a matter of fact, if you end up pulling this outwards, right, and you look at the data even further, it's really not until about age 60 that you might see a slight decrease in metabolism. Not really, because 60, 65, I think that's when you start seeing a decline. And really around age 70 is where you might actually see we're talking real slight, like not noticeable at all. And then you start having this downward trajectory. So really when you get into your 70s, 80s, and definitely in your 90s, then that's when you have this decrease in metabolism. Now, the thing that I glossed over that I didn't actually mention is that the researchers separate out men versus women. And of course, this is relative, so it's not an absolute scale. So it's not, of course, men are going to have a higher metabolism than women on the whole, but this is really just looking at relative to other men and relative to other women. And they find that really, maybe there might be a slightly higher metabolism for boys, especially during puberty. But, once you get into adulthood, the relative, again, keep in mind that key word there, relative metabolism is the exact same for men and women across the adult lifespan. I find this graph really, really telling. It's a really fantastic way to display all of the work that they put in. Just think about it. Just this one graph shows so much of the information that they were able to collect. So just to recap one more time, when you're an infant, massive metabolism spike, then it starts to decline, but still really, really high, way above adult levels, through puberty into your early 20s. And once you're into your 20s, it starts to plateau out, although it's at adult levels. And then that stays until you're 60, 65. I think the researchers specifically mentioned like 60 something years old was when you actually saw a noticeable, measurable decline in metabolism. But even then, it's still very small. And then you see more dramatic declines once you get into your 80s and 90s. Okay, so then that might raise the question. I might raise a question of like, well, what are the determining factors? And they wanted to know that as well. So they didn't just stop here. This technically answers the question, but of metabolism, or, does it decline? When does it decline? How much does it decline? Et cetera, et cetera. But, and actually, I suppose I should say for how much it declines, one last point on that. Once you reach about your 90s, 95 or so, if you're lucky enough to get to that age, you get about a 20 to 25% decline in metabolism off of the relative to the adult levels. So it's a pretty substantial decline in metabolism. So, but overall, what is this decline in metabolism? What is causing this metabolic decline? Okay, so if you're watching the podcast, you might think this is a little confusing. Don't worry, it's actually super simple, and I'll explain it to you, and you'll be able to read it and understand it super well. So here in green, and if you're listening, don't worry, I'll be explaining things. Here they're trying to figure out what factors play into metabolism decline, right? As I mentioned before. But in green here, they have the actual recorded values. So you see, and this is based off of like predictions and whatnot, but they've got the actual recorded values. So they've got their total energy expenditure, their basal energy expenditure, and activity energy expenditure. But really, if you just focus on one of them, let's just focus on the total. You see that energy expenditure is quite high relative to fat-free mass. So lean mass, if lean mass increases, then you have increases in energy expenditure, okay? Pretty simple, right? If you think of a more muscular person, they tend to have a higher metabolism relative to the same person with less muscle. Not groundbreaking research here, but this is what they actually measured. And the adult phase up here is their kind of plateau period. And then, of course, once you get to about 60-something, you get this start to have this decline. Same results as what they showed in the other, just it looks kind of wonky. And then they've got an adjusted measure here for based off of age. So fat-free mass is one graph or one picture, and then, one graph, and then the other one is age. So that's the actual recorded measurements. Now in blue here, they've got this what's called, I'm calling it a static model, where they're essentially clamping physical activity. Remember, I mentioned that physical activity is one of the contributors to metabolism and whatnot. So they're clamping physical activity and they're clamping tissue metabolism. So let's assume that what they're essentially doing is, let's assume that physical activity stays at a particular point and we're just going to continue it out. And let's just assume that tissue metabolism, so your brain, your muscles, your bones, all of those different tissues, your liver, your kidneys, etc., are all going to use the exact same amount of energy at one point as they will 40 years from now, 50 years from now. They're going to use the exact same. And what that prediction, this is all in blue, is just a prediction, is not actual data. So the prediction would say that there would be a relatively similar level of metabolism across the board, and it wouldn't really matter. I mean, they show maybe a slight bump with adolescence or with infancy, but beyond that, everything would just be stagnant. And we know that's not true. I mean, we just saw the data. Obviously, it's not true, but they still wanted to throw this in here to show that this is not predictive. So clearly, these have to play factors. Physical activity and tissue metabolism have to play factors if we're going to predict something that doesn't look like this, but looks more like this, right? Looks more like the actual results if you're listening. So then what they do is they use the dynamic model where they plot this information based off of a prediction of physical activity over age and tissue metabolism over age. So what would you predict physical activity to be, let's say, when you're younger? Well, it's probably going to be really high unless you're playing a lot of video games and stuff like that. But even so, like even with the video games, kids just tend to run around a lot. They just tend to be more active. They can't sit in one place very easily. There's a lot of spontaneous activity going on. So this is where you get this spike in physical activity. So that's an increase in metabolism from that alone. Then they also show that there's a spike in tissue metabolism. And I mean, come on, that's pretty self-explanatory, right? You have this human being that is like a larva and it's turning into this huge human being. And that happens, I mean, on scale very quickly, right? So let's say from that larva stage to like 8 years old, 10 years old, your metabolism, you're growing, you're multiplying, all these cells are going all through these cell divisions and placing themselves in the correct orientations and creating everything that they need to create. So these massive amounts of energy are being used. So tissue metabolism is really high. You've got brain development that continues to go on, things like that. Okay, so both of those are highly increased according to this predicted model, which makes sense. Then it decreases back into your 20s, and then it kind of plateaus outwards. And here is where we get some interesting, again, just thoughts, but we're going to substantiate that with the actual data here in just a minute. So this is all just predictive off of what I'm calling this dynamic model. So then you have this plateau, and physical activity plateaus out, and and metabolism of the tissue metabolism also plateaus out. And tissue metabolism kind of sticks out, kind of stays stable for maybe 65, 70 years, or up to 65, 70 years old. And physical activity, however, starts to decline around age 40 or so, around 45, 40, so on, maybe 50. And they're predicting that if they use this model where physical activity decreases from the adult values, of course they're going to be much lower than the infancy values, and they stick to this kind of stagnant model. I don't want to call it stagnant, but consistent model for tissue metabolism, saying that once your brain is developed, it's going to be using X amount of energy for, let's say, 30, 40, 50 years. You're not going to have tons of increases, but you're also not going to see a bunch of decreases. Muscle, same thing, et cetera, et cetera. And that leads to a profile that looks like this. If you're listening to the podcast, it's difficult for me to actually explain this, the actual graphs themselves. You might want to come over and look over. But ultimately, my point being that if you compare this predictive model to this actual model, it looks very similar by comparison to the static model that I was talking about earlier. And ultimately, what that means is that, yes, that these two factors are the biggest factors. Those are the biggest factors, that physical activity and tissue metabolism are the big two that affect our predictions and what we're actually getting out of actual information from this metabolism data that we're picking up from these thousands of individuals. So that actually could give us some information that might be useful. And with this tissue metabolism, for example, I think that's obviously something that's you're not able to change that very much. You can gain musculature, which of course is always recommended. Gaining your muscle will increase your metabolism a little bit, or at least preserve your metabolism. But there's more than just muscle. There's also your brain. And this is actually something I discussed in that video that I mentioned at the beginning, something that I'd released, that brain volume starts to decrease around like age 60 or something along those lines. And not to any noticeable degree until you get to about your 80s or so. And of course, you're going to start having atrophy. And of course, you can do exercises and stuff to try to mitigate some of that. But, eventually some of that stuff is going to happen regardless. And same thing with muscle, right? You can work out and you can hold on to a lot of muscle, but eventually you're going to have some decreases in musculature. And this is all based on people that largely don't exercise, or they'll at least get watered out by people that do, that don't exercise. So this tells us a lot of really interesting information. You can change tissue metabolism maybe a little bit if you're talking about muscle, but beyond that, it's pretty consistent. However, physical activity does change, and that's actually something you can consciously make a change over, right? You can actually you can take longer time to walk to your car. You can park further away. Like, you can do small things like that. It doesn't have to be exercise. It doesn't have to be, I got to run 5 miles a day or anything like that, which I'm sure might be a relief to some people. But if once you get into your 60s, maybe deciding to bike to work, or deciding to walk to the coffee shop instead of drive there, or things like that can at least maintain your metabolism for a time, and then you have to do a little bit more, and then you have to do a little bit more, et cetera, as the tissue metabolism starts to decrease. You got to start making up for that by increasing physical activity to make up that discrepancy. And that's why, well, at least one of the reasons, certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons why you might have people that are elderly, but they're in great shape, because they implement a lot of that stuff, not knowingly, of course, but they implement a lot of this physical activity, and they have this kind of active lifestyle as a whole. So, in totality, in conclusion, this means that metabolism spikes really high, goes like 50% above adult values when you are a child, and that's where you have to eat a lot, right? And as you're growing, as you're building, And puberty is about 25% higher than adult values. Then around your 20s, it stagnates, or not stagnates, but it falls down to the actual adult values. And then contrary to a lot of people's, kind of this myth that once you hit your 30s, it's all downhill. Not at all. Not the case at all. Once you hit your 30s, it's consistent. So from the 20s all the way until 60, 65, 70 years old, your metabolism stays the exact same, with the only thing that actually determines this decrease in metabolism being probably physical activity, not your actual body. Your body's not betraying you. You're not getting older and therefore losing your metabolism. It is your physical activity that's declining. You may be more at work. You might be at a cubicle. You might be maybe your physical activity is the same, but you're bored and you're just consuming more. You're just snacking more, and that's doing you in. You don't have a good grip on how much you're consuming, things like that. So ultimately, this means that metabolism is quite stable. As a matter of fact, remarkably so. You can increase your metabolism by changing your tissues, gaining more muscle, being more physically active, and especially once you hit your 70s or so, making sure that you focus a little bit more on walking a little bit more, or taking the long way around, or exercising, or something along those lines, can have some pretty dramatic effects at maintaining your metabolism over time, even into your 70s and 80s, even though with each passing year, you're going to want to do just a little bit more to make sure that your overall metabolism stays consistent with what it was, let's say, at 60 years old. Okay, though, folks, that's what I've got for you. Hopefully, if you're listening, it's a lot of graphs and stuff, so it's a little hard for me to explain. Hopefully, I did a decent job. But if you're watching, hopefully this was informative for you. And I think I'll probably release a video on pregnancy, the change in metabolism from pregnancy, because this paper also discussed that as well. So with that, I'll catch you in the next one, and have a wonderful day, and I'll hope to speak with you in the future. Bye.